The day I arrived at the mansion in Savannah, the air felt thick, like I could almost taste the damp humidity as it clung to my skin. I stepped out of the car, glancing at the structure that loomed ahead, its once grand exterior now weathered and forgotten. The house had belonged to a distant uncle, someone I barely remembered from my childhood, but now it was mine. I didn't want it. Lily, my daughter, got out of the car and stood silently beside me. She looked at the house with her arms crossed over her chest, her expression a mixture of disdain and indifference. It had been nearly a year since the divorce, and the chasm between us had only grown wider. I thought that maybe this summer would give us a chance to reconnect, but seeing her here, so distant, so much like her mother, I wondered if it was already too late. The mansion was massive, but time had not been kind. Vines clung to the stone walls, windows were covered in a layer of grime, and the front steps sagged under the weight of years. The wood creaked underfoot as we approached the door, which stuck for a moment before it finally gave way with a groan. Inside, the smell hit me first, musty and damp, like a place that hadn't felt a breath of fresh air in decades. The furniture was covered in dusty sheets, and the wooden floorboards creaked with every step we took. It was dark, too, despite the daylight outside, with only thin shafts of light penetrating the thick curtains that hung limply from the windows. Is this really where we're staying? Lily's voice cut through the silence, sharp with disbelief. I forced a smile. It just needs a little work. We'll fix it up together. She didn't respond, only rolled her eyes and walked further into the house, her footsteps echoing through the hollow halls. I watched her go, a familiar ache settling in my chest. The same ache I'd felt since the divorce papers had been signed. The house had a strange energy. I could feel it from the moment I stepped through the door. It was as if the walls were watching us, the silence too heavy, too deliberate. I shook off the feeling and tried to focus on practical matters. We needed to unpack, clean up the space, and start making it livable. By the time the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the rooms, we had barely made a dent in the dust and grime. Lily had retreated to her room upstairs, leaving me alone in the kitchen, where I stood staring at an old oil lamp that looked like it had come straight out of the 19th century. That's when I first noticed it, a sound, faint but distinct, coming from somewhere beneath the floor. It was a soft scratching noise, like something dragging itself across wood. I froze, my ears straining to catch it again, but the house had fallen back into silence. Shaking my head, I brushed it off. The house was old, probably full of animals and pests. It was nothing, I told myself. Just an old house making old house noises. But something about that sound stuck with me. Even after I went upstairs to check on Lily, who was sitting cross-legged on her bed with her headphones on, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house wasn't quite as empty as it seemed. Something lurked beneath the surface, hidden just out of sight. Later that night, as I lay in bed, the house creaked and groaned like it was settling around us. But beneath those familiar sounds, I could have sworn I heard that scratching noise again, faint, almost imperceptible, but there. I turned over, trying to ignore it, hoping that tomorrow would bring more clarity. I didn't realize then that this house had secrets, old, dark secrets that had been buried for years. Secrets that had been waiting, patiently, for someone to return.
The next morning, the sunlight streamed through the grimy windows, casting dull beams across the floor as I made my way to the attic. The previous night's unease had faded slightly with the light of day, but there was still a lingering tension in the air, one I couldn't quite shake. The attic was stuffy, thick with dust, and filled with forgotten things. Boxes stacked haphazardly, furniture draped in sheets, and old trunks, all relics of a time long past. I pulled the cord on the dangling light bulb, illuminating the room with a dim, flickering glow. As I sifted through some of the boxes, I found old letters, photographs, and papers, remnants of my uncle's life. Buried beneath a stack of old newspapers, something caught my eye, a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and faded with age. Curiosity piqued, I sat down on an old chair and opened it. The first few pages were filled with mundane details, notes on repairs to the house, the weather, idle thoughts. But as I flipped further, the tone began to shift. "There's something wrong with this house," one entry read. "I've heard things beneath the floors, scratching at night. At first, I thought it was just rats or some other vermin, but it feels wrong. Too deliberate. Too close." The more I read, the more disturbed I became. My uncle had written at length about strange occurrences in the mansion, things moving on their own, footsteps in the hallways when no one was there, voices whispering in the dark. And then there was the floor. "I've tried to seal the floorboards," one passage said, "but whatever it is keeps coming back. I hear it at night, scratching, moving. Sometimes I think it's trying to get out." I closed the journal, my heart pounding in my chest. The memories of the previous night came flooding back, the scratching sound beneath the floor, the eerie stillness of the house. I shook my head, trying to shake off the creeping fear. It was just an old house, I told myself. My uncle had been old, probably confused or paranoid in his final days. There was no reason to believe anything he wrote. But that didn't stop the unease from settling in my stomach like a lead weight. I carried the journal downstairs and tucked it away in the kitchen drawer, out of sight. As I went about my day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every little creak and groan of the house seemed louder, sharper, and every time the floorboards shifted under my feet, I found myself pausing, listening for the sounds I didn't want to hear. That night, as I lay in bed once again, the house seemed even quieter than before. But as the silence stretched on, I heard it again, the soft, almost imperceptible scratching beneath the floorboards. It was closer this time.
The scratching woke me in the middle of the night. I bolted upright, my heart hammering in my chest. For a moment, I thought it was just another dream, my mind playing tricks on me. But no, the sound was real. It was louder than before, persistent, coming from directly beneath my bed. I swung my legs over the side, placing my feet on the cold floor. The noise stopped instantly, leaving the house in an oppressive silence. I held my breath, listening, waiting for something, anything. But nothing came. Reluctantly, I stood up and padded to the doorway, glancing back at the bed, half expecting to see something emerge from beneath it. But the room remained still, empty except for the shadows clinging to the corners. Lily's room was down the hall, her door slightly ajar. I hesitated for a moment before pushing it open and stepping inside. She was asleep, her headphones still on, faint music drifting through the quiet. I watched her for a moment, feeling a strange mix of relief and unease. I left her room as quietly as I had entered, but as I turned to head back to bed, I heard it again, the scratching. This time, it was coming from directly beneath the floor in the hallway. I knelt down, pressing my ear to the floorboards. The sound was faint, but distinct, something dragging itself, slowly, methodically, beneath the house. My skin prickled with unease. I was about to pull away when suddenly the floor creaked beneath me. It wasn't the usual groan of old wood. This was different. It was as if something beneath the boards had shifted, moved. A small gasp escaped my lips as the wood beneath my hands flexed upward, ever so slightly. I scrambled to my feet, staring down at the floor. The house fell silent again, as if whatever had stirred was waiting for me to leave. I stood there, frozen, my breath caught in my throat, afraid to make a sound. Eventually, I retreated back to my room, my mind racing. I wanted to tell myself that I was imagining things, that it was just an old house settling, that the journal had planted ideas in my head. But as I lay there in bed, staring at the ceiling, I knew that wasn't true. The next morning, Lily looked at me with tired eyes as she sat at the kitchen table, her cereal untouched. "I heard it too," she said quietly. I froze. "What did you hear?" "The scratching," she murmured, her gaze dropping to the floor. "It was under my room." I tried to keep my voice steady. "It's probably just some animals. This house is old, after all." But the look on Lily's face told me she didn't believe that. And neither did I. The scratching had stopped for now, but I knew it wasn't over. Whatever was under the floor wasn't going to stay hidden for long.
The days that followed were filled with an eerie quiet, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. I tried to focus on the repairs, anything to keep my mind occupied, but every time the floor creaked or a shadow shifted in the corner of my eye, my heart would skip a beat. Lily grew more withdrawn. She refused to stay in her room, opting instead to sleep on the couch in the living room where the light from the hallway could spill into the room. She said it made her feel safer, but I could see the exhaustion weighing on her. Dark circles began to form under her eyes, her usual spark dimmed. The distance between us, already wide, seemed to stretch further with each passing day. And then, the entity started to make its presence known in more direct ways. One afternoon, while I was fixing a loose floorboard in the hallway, I heard a loud crash from the kitchen. I rushed in to find the dishes that had been neatly stacked on the counter now scattered across the floor, broken into jagged pieces. Lily stood frozen in the doorway, her eyes wide with fear. "I didn't touch anything," she whispered, her voice trembling. I believed her. The dishes hadn't fallen naturally. They looked like they had been swiped off the counter with force. As I crouched down to clean up the mess, I felt it again, that cold, creeping sensation that something was watching us. My skin prickled, and the air felt heavy, like the house was pressing down on me. It wasn't just the dishes, either. Objects began to move on their own. Chairs would shift slightly when we weren't looking, doors would creak open even though we had closed them, and the temperature would drop suddenly in certain rooms, sending shivers down our spines. The entity wasn't content to stay hidden anymore. It was growing bolder. At night, the scratching returned with a vengeance, louder and more aggressive. It seemed to move beneath us as we slept, traveling from room to room, never staying in one place for long. I would lie awake, listening to it, my body tense with fear, wondering when it would finally break through. Lily started having nightmares. She would wake up in a cold sweat, gasping for breath, her eyes wide with terror. She told me about the dark figures she saw in her dreams, shadowy shapes that lurked just out of reach, whispering to her, calling her name. One night, she woke up screaming. I rushed to her side, finding her sitting bolt upright on the couch, her face pale and drenched in sweat. "They were in my room," she sobbed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw them, Dad. They were standing at the foot of my bed." I tried to calm her down, to reassure her that it was just a dream, but deep down, I knew she was right. The entity was no longer content to scratch beneath the floors. It was trying to reach us, trying to break through the thin veil that separated its world from ours. Desperation began to set in. I could feel the entity's influence growing stronger with each passing day, feeding off our fear, our isolation. It wasn't just the house that was falling apart, it was us. Lily barely spoke to me anymore, and when she did, it was only in short, clipped sentences. I could see the distrust in her eyes, the way she recoiled from me whenever I tried to comfort her. I spent hours reading through the journal, hoping to find some kind of solution, some way to stop the entity before it was too late. But the deeper I delved into my uncle's notes, the more hopeless it seemed. He had tried everything, rituals, charms, even attempts to communicate with the entity, but nothing had worked. The house had consumed him, just as it was beginning to consume us. One night, as I sat at the kitchen table, the journal open in front of me, I felt a sudden chill wash over me. The lights flickered, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch and twist, like dark tendrils reaching for me. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shadow moving across the floor, too solid to be a trick of the light, too real to ignore. It slithered toward me, its movement slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it approach, and for the first time, I felt the entity's presence in the room with me. It wasn't just scratching beneath the floorboards anymore. It was here.
The next morning, the knock on the door startled me out of my fog of exhaustion. I had barely slept, haunted by the shadowy presence that now seemed to lurk in every corner of the house. Lily was sitting on the couch, her knees drawn up to her chest, when the sound of the knock echoed through the silent house. I opened the door to find a woman standing there, dressed in a dark, neatly pressed suit. She had a no-nonsense look about her, her sharp eyes scanning the house behind me even as she introduced herself. "Detective Morgan," she said, flashing a badge. "I'm investigating a few recent disappearances in the area. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" My heart skipped a beat. "Disappearances?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I hadn't heard anything about that. Her gaze settled on me, piercing and unrelenting. A few locals have gone missing in the past couple of months. Last seen around the outskirts of town, not too far from here. She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. You've been living in this house for how long now? Just a few weeks, I replied, stepping aside to let her in. But I haven't seen or heard anything unusual. That last part was a lie, of course. The truth was that almost everything about this house had been unusual since the day I stepped foot inside. But I wasn't about to tell her that. I couldn't explain what was happening, and even if I tried, I doubted she would believe me. Detective Morgan walked into the living room, her sharp eyes darting around, taking in the worn furniture, the peeling wallpaper, and the layers of dust that seemed to cling to every surface. Lily watched her warily from the couch, her arms still wrapped tightly around her knees. Has anyone been by here recently? Detective Morgan asked, glancing over at Lily. I shook my head. No one. We've been pretty isolated. She frowned, her eyes briefly landing on the journal that still lay open on the kitchen table. And nothing strange? No disturbances? I hesitated, my mind racing. I couldn't tell her about the shadows, the sounds beneath the floorboards, the way the house felt like it was alive, waiting. Instead, I gave a half-hearted shrug. Nothing that I can think of, I lied again. Her gaze lingered on me for a moment longer before she nodded. All right, if you notice anything unusual, anything at all, you give me a call. She handed me a card, her fingers brushing against mine briefly. Her expression softened, just slightly. This house, it has a history. Be careful. With that, she turned and left, leaving a cold weight settling in my chest. I stood there for a long moment, staring down at the card in my hand, feeling the oppressive air of the house closing in on me. Detective Morgan had seen something. Maybe she knew more than she was letting on. Maybe she was right to be suspicious. One thing was certain, whatever was happening in this house, it wasn't finished with us yet.
That evening, the tension in the house felt suffocating, as if the walls were closing in. Lily had retreated to her makeshift bed on the couch again, and I found myself pacing the darkened hallway, my mind racing with thoughts of Detective Morgan and her cryptic warning. The journal still lay open on the kitchen table, its worn pages spread out like an invitation I wasn't sure I wanted to accept. But something pulled me toward it, some need to understand what was happening, to make sense of the chaos that had gripped the house and refused to let go. I sat down and flipped through the journal, scanning the entries for anything that could help me. And then I found it, a passage that sent a chill down my spine. I attempted the ritual again last night, but I fear it is too late. The bindings are weak and the entity is growing stronger. It no longer hides in the shadows. It no longer fears the light. If anyone should find this journal, heed this warning. Do not disturb the floorboards. It is there, waiting, always waiting. The words sent a shiver through me. My uncle had tried to bind the entity, to trap it beneath the floor, but it hadn't worked. I realized now that by disturbing the floorboards, I might have released it, weakening whatever hold my uncle had managed to maintain. I heard a noise from the living room, a low creak, followed by a soft thud. My heart leaped into my throat as I rushed to check on Lily. She was sitting up on the couch, her eyes wide with fear, staring at something just beyond my shoulder. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's behind you." I turned slowly, my body stiff with dread. At first, I saw nothing, just the dimly lit hallway, the shadows clinging to the walls. But then I saw it. A shape, darker than the surrounding shadows, creeping across the floor toward us. It moved slowly, deliberately, its form shifting and slithering like a living nightmare. The air grew colder, and I could feel the entity's presence as it neared. My skin prickled with fear, and a deep, instinctual terror rooted me to the spot. It wasn't just a shadow. It was something more, something ancient and malevolent, something that had been trapped in this house for far too long. I grabbed Lily's arm, pulling her up from the couch. "Get upstairs," I whispered urgently. "Now." We scrambled up the stairs, the entity following us, its dark form stretching across the walls like ink spreading through water. It didn't hurry, it didn't need to. It knew we were trapped. This house was its domain, and we had nowhere to run. We reached the second floor and hurried into one of the bedrooms, slamming the door behind us. I pushed a heavy dresser in front of the door, my hands shaking with adrenaline. "What was that?" Lily gasped, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I admitted, my heart pounding in my chest. "But it's not going to stop." I sank down onto the bed, my mind racing. The entity was no longer content to remain beneath the floorboards. It was free now, its dark influence spreading throughout the house. And it was getting stronger. I could feel it in the air, in the way the shadows seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. There was only one solution left. I had to finish what my uncle had started. I had to perform the binding ritual described in the journal. But I knew it wouldn't be easy. The ritual required more than just words. It required a sacrifice. And I wasn't sure I was ready to pay the price. Lily sat beside me, her face pale and drawn. I could see the fear in her eyes, but there was also something else, trust. Despite everything, she was looking to me for answers, for protection. I had failed her so many times before, but I couldn't fail her now. Not when everything was at stake. The entity was no longer hiding. It was here, in this house, and it wouldn't rest until it had claimed what it wanted. And deep down, I knew that what it wanted was us.
I knew that whatever happened next, we couldn't keep running from the entity. It was becoming stronger, more aggressive, and with every passing moment, it tightened its grip on the house. The walls felt like they were closing in, and the very air seemed to hum with its malevolent presence. I realized there was no escape, not without facing it head-on. The only choice left was to finish the ritual my uncle had started. The journal was clear about one thing. The entity was bound to the house, trapped beneath the floorboards by a tenuous seal. That seal had been broken, but there was still a chance to restore it if I acted quickly and had the resolve to see it through. With Lily at my side, I made my way back to the kitchen, where the journal lay open on the table. The air felt colder here, heavier. It was as if the entity knew what I was planning and was watching, waiting. I glanced down at the journal, my fingers tracing the yellowed pages, feeling the weight of the words that lay before me. "What's the plan?" Lily asked, her voice wavering as she stood close by, her eyes darting around the room as if expecting the entity to strike at any moment. I took a deep breath. The ritual, it's a binding spell. We can force the entity back beneath the floorboards, but it requires a sacrifice. Lily's eyes widened. What kind of sacrifice? I hesitated. I hadn't fully accepted what the ritual demanded until that moment. It wasn't just a symbolic offering. It needed something real, something painful, something from the heart. The journal was vague, but the underlying message was clear. The house demanded a toll, and without it, the entity would remain free. "I'll do it," I said, my voice steady despite the fear churning in my gut. "I'll finish what my uncle started." Lily looked at me, her brow furrowed. "You can't do this alone, Dad. We've both been pulled into this. We need to face it together." I wanted to argue, to tell her that I couldn't bear to put her at risk any more than she already was, but I knew she was right. This house had taken so much from us, our peace, our safety, even the fragile bond we had left. We couldn't let it take anything else. I nodded, and together we gathered the items necessary for the ritual. Salt, candles, the journal, all the things my uncle had written about. I felt a strange sense of calm as we prepared, as if the enormity of the situation had finally sunk in, leaving only a grim determination behind. We moved the old furniture in the living room aside, creating a large open space. The ritual needed to take place where the entity's presence was strongest, and that was here, directly above the spot where the floorboards had been disturbed. The shadows in the room flickered ominously as we lit the candles, their dim light barely holding back the dark tendrils creeping along the walls. I could feel it now, the entity pressing in on us, its anger palpable. It knew what we were trying to do, and it wasn't going to let us succeed without a fight. As I began reciting the incantation from the journal, the air grew colder still, and a low, guttural growl echoed through the room. The floor beneath us trembled, and Lily let out a small gasp as the shadows around us began to pulse and writhe. The entity was close now, so close I could almost feel its icy breath on the back of my neck. But I couldn't stop. I continued chanting, the words foreign and harsh on my tongue, but I pressed on, willing the ritual to work. The shadows gathered in the center of the room, coalescing into a dark, writhing mass. The growling grew louder, more intense, and I knew that we had pushed the entity to its breaking point. It was fighting back, and we were running out of time. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the house, and the front door burst open. Detective Morgan stood in the doorway, her gun drawn, her eyes wide with shock as she took in the scene before her. "What the hell is going on?" she shouted, but her voice was almost drowned out by the roar of the entity. "Lily, keep chanting," I yelled, my voice barely audible over the cacophony of noise. I turned to Detective Morgan. "You need to help us, or none of us are getting out of here alive." Her eyes flicked to the writhing shadows, and for a moment, she hesitated. But then, with a grim nod, she stepped forward, her face set in determination. Whatever doubts she had were buried under the immediate threat in front of her. We had drawn the entity out. Now we had to bind it, or we would all be lost to the darkness that had consumed this house.
The room had become a battlefield of shadows and fear. The entity's roar reverberated through the house, shaking the very foundations beneath our feet. The air was thick with tension, and every shadow seemed alive, reaching out with dark tendrils, seeking to engulf us. My heart pounded as I struggled to keep my voice steady, chanting the ancient words from the journal while Detective Morgan kept her eyes locked on the shifting mass of darkness that now dominated the center of the room. Lily's voice joined mine, shaky but determined, as we chanted in unison, our words overlapping and blending together. The shadows pulsed violently, the entity's rage mounting with every syllable. It knew what we were doing. It could feel the binding ritual taking hold, and it was fighting back with everything it had. As I continued to chant, I could feel a strange pull deep within me, a force that tugged at something buried inside. The journal had warned about the sacrifice, but until this moment, I hadn't understood the true cost. This wasn't just about words or objects, it was about giving up something vital, something personal. The house wanted more than just blood. It wanted part of my soul. The journal's instructions had been clear, even if they had been difficult to accept. In order to bind the entity, I had to offer something of myself in exchange. My uncle had tried, but he hadn't given enough. His failure had allowed the entity to bide its time, growing stronger, waiting for its moment of freedom. But I wouldn't fail, not if it meant saving Lily. The entity writhed in front of us, its form twisting and changing, becoming more solid by the second. Dark, rotted hands emerged from the shadows, clawing at the air, reaching for us. Its face began to take shape, a grotesque mask of hatred and fury that filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread. I felt the pull again, stronger this time, more insistent. It felt like a cold hand gripping my chest, squeezing, demanding. I stumbled in the middle of the chant, gasping for breath as the weight of the sacrifice bore down on me. The room seemed to spin, and I could feel my strength draining away, as if the entity was feeding off my very life force. "Dad." Lily's voice broke through the chaos, her eyes wide with fear as she reached for me. "You have to keep going." I nodded weakly, forcing myself to stand upright, to push past the pain that was gnawing at my insides. I couldn't stop now. I wouldn't stop. I glanced at Lily, her face pale but determined, and felt a surge of love and protectiveness. I had to finish this for her. With a final, desperate breath, I resumed the chant, giving myself over to the ritual completely. I could feel the entity's power beginning to wane, its strength faltering as the binding spell took hold. But it wasn't enough. It needed more. I took a step forward, toward the writhing shadows, toward the entity itself. I could feel its cold, dark presence wrapping around me, pulling me closer. My chest tightened, and my breath came in short, ragged gasps, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I had to give it what it wanted. With a trembling hand, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the one thing that had been with me since I'd arrived at the house, a photograph of Lily from when she was younger, before the divorce, when we were still a family. It was all I had left of that time, of who I had been, of the life I had lost. I held the photograph out in front of me, offering it to the darkness, feeling the weight of the sacrifice in my chest. The shadows recoiled for a moment, as if uncertain, and then they surged forward, engulfing the photo, swallowing it whole. I felt the house tremble beneath my feet as the entity roared in fury, but the pull on my chest began to lessen. Slowly, the shadows around us began to recede, shrinking back toward the center of the room, as if retreating into the cracks in the floorboards. The air grew lighter, the oppressive weight lifting, but I could still feel the entity's presence, lurking just beneath the surface, watching, waiting. The sacrifice had bound it for now. The candles flickered and then went out, plunging the room into darkness. I stood there, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the photo now gone, consumed by the ritual. But Lily was safe, and that was all that mattered. Detective Morgan lowered her gun, her face pale as she stared at the spot where the entity had been. The room was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft rustle of the wind outside. The entity was bound, but I knew that it would never truly be gone. As I looked at the floorboards beneath us, I realized that the battle was over, but the war was far from won. The house had taken its toll, and it wasn't finished with us yet. The aftermath was a strange kind of stillness. The air felt lighter, but there was an undercurrent of tension that made every breath feel fragile. The candles had long since snuffed out, leaving only darkness and the faint scent of smoke in their wake. I could still feel the cold weight of the entity lurking just beneath the surface of the house, even though the ritual had worked for now. Lily was at my side, her hand trembling slightly as she reached out to touch my arm. I could see the exhaustion in her eyes, but there was also a flicker of relief, the tiniest glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, this nightmare was over. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Now." Detective Morgan nodded in agreement, her face as pale as a ghost. She holstered her gun, but her hand stayed close to it, as if she expected the shadows to spring to life again at any moment. I couldn't blame her. I felt it too. The entity's presence still lingered in the house, weakened but not defeated. We had to leave before it regained any more strength. We moved quickly, gathering what little we could and making our way toward the front door. Every step felt like it could be our last. The floor creaked and groaned beneath our feet, and the walls seemed to shift slightly, as if the house itself was watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. As we stepped outside, a wave of relief washed over me. The cool night air felt like a blessing, cleansing the oppressive weight that had settled over my chest since the moment we entered the mansion. For the first time in what felt like weeks, I could breathe freely. Behind us, the house loomed, its windows dark and empty, the twisted shadows within no longer writhing with life, but still menacing in their silence. I could feel the entity's fury simmering just beneath the surface, bound but not destroyed. It was trapped in the house, just as it had been before, but the binding was tenuous, fragile. I knew it was only a matter of time before the entity would find a way to break free again. Lily stood next to me, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, shivering despite the warmth of the summer night. I placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to offer some comfort, but I could feel the toll the ordeal had taken on her. She was changed, just like I was. We both were. Detective Morgan walked toward her car, her steps heavy with exhaustion. She stopped just before getting in, turning to face us one last time. "Whatever happened in there," she said, her voice low, "I don't think it's over. Be careful." I nodded, knowing that her words held more truth than I cared to admit. As she drove away, the sound of her engine fading into the distance, I turned back to the house one last time. The shadows in the window seemed to shift, just slightly. The house had claimed its toll, and though we had escaped, I knew it was only a matter of time before it called out again. But for now, we were free.
We left Savannah the next morning, the sunrise casting a soft, golden glow over the city as we drove away from the mansion. The house receded into the distance, a distant shadow now, but its presence still lingered in my mind. No matter how far we went, I knew I'd never be truly free of it. The things we had seen, what we had endured, had left a mark that would never fully heal. Lily sat quietly in the passenger seat, staring out the window as the landscape rolled by. She hadn't spoken much since we left the house, but I knew she was processing everything in her own way. Her face was pale, drawn, as if the entity had stolen some part of her that might never return. I reached out and gently squeezed her hand. "We're going to be okay," I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. She glanced at me and gave a small nod, but her eyes remained distant, lost in thoughts she wouldn't share. The miles stretched out in front of us, the road winding through small towns and endless stretches of forest. As we drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was still with us, that the shadows clinging to its walls had somehow followed us. Every dark corner, every flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye made my heart race. I wondered if I would ever stop looking over my shoulder, waiting for the entity to reappear. But I also felt a sense of relief, a strange, fragile hope that maybe we had done enough. Maybe for now, the house was satisfied. The entity was bound, and we had escaped its grasp. The sacrifice I made had been real, and it had worked. But I couldn't help but wonder what it would take the next time, what the house would demand if it ever called out to us again. Lily's voice finally broke the silence. "Do you think it's over?" she asked quietly, not looking at me but keeping her eyes on the road ahead. I hesitated before answering. "I think it's over for now," I said truthfully. "But that house, it doesn't let go easily. We have to be careful." She nodded, her expression serious. "I'm scared it's not done with us." I couldn't argue with her. I felt the same. The house had taken something from us, something we could never get back. But we had survived. That had to count for something. As we continued down the road, I caught a glimpse of a figure standing in the shadows at the edge of the trees, just for a moment, a flicker of movement that made my breath catch in my throat. But when I looked again, there was nothing there. Just the empty road stretching out before us. I couldn't be sure if it was my imagination or if the entity's reach extended beyond the boundaries of the house. But I knew one thing for certain, it wasn't truly over. Not yet. I gripped the steering wheel tighter and kept driving, the weight of the house still pressing down on me. Lily and I had survived the nightmare, but we were changed. The shadows of the house would follow us for the rest of our lives. But for now, we had escaped. And that was enough.
If you enjoyed unraveling this, you're in for another spine-tingling tale. Click the video on your screen to discover more eerie stories from the Phantom Story Society, where history's darkest secrets come to life. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Until next time, stay curious and beware of the shadows.